Hello, my name is Dana Jeffrey, and today I'm going to be presenting on youth climate action by the Dene people, youth of Deco First Nations in the Northwest Territories. This is called Uplifting Deco First Nations Youth Voices, a presentation on how Deco First Nations in the Northwest Territories is holding a youth-led council to promote climate change action by teaching traditional Dene values. And for anyone interested, this is the Facebook page in which they talk about this stuff. And also for anyone interested, this is the the flyer for the Climate Change Action Conference that was held in 2022. So how it works. The Deco Youth Energy Action Council is a council within Deneco First Nations that is a youth-led initiative based on incorporating traditional Dene teachings into climate change action and land preservation. In 2022, a youth conference took place called Deneco Youth Energy Action Council in order to address concerns within the community and source funding for future projects. This was an introduction for youth voices to be heard in the community and advocate for the future of their land. The youth work closely with elders of the community who teach traditional values, non-invasive practices like fishing, hunting, and animal tracking. They also learn also learn the lost Dene culture language, another way youth work to promote traditional values. In 2025, the Deneco Youth Energy Council was nominated for the Arctic Inspiration Prize. West Point First Nations 26-year-old Chief Devin Flecker, who is a member of the Deneco Youth Energy Action Council, spoke at the Dene National First Nations Assembly in Fort Hoth in 2026. Flecker took the stage and talked about how Arctic Indigenous youth should be put in more leadership positions for youth to be involved in decision-making within the communities they reside. Flecker said that the decline in youth interest in leadership roles is due to a lack of representation within the youth leadership and in communities. So the challenges. As Chief Devin Fletcher mentioned, there is a decline in interest from youth in land-based activities. This could be due to youth not feeling representative in leadership roles. Loss of traditional values due to colonization could also be a factor in why the turnout for youth action has gone down since 2022. Another challenge the group faces is funding. In 2022, the group was awarded $100,000 to go towards programming to incorporate green initiatives. However, there is no mention of any funding being dispersed since. So just a little history of the Dene people of Northwest Territories and the issues with pipelines. The Northwest Territories of Canada sits atop over 30 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In 2009, a study was done to get feedback from the Dene people and other Indigenous communities across Northwest Ontario to see how they felt about pipelines being built in the surrounding areas. The Chateau community had concerns about how the air population and pipeline would affect the caribou of the area, as the Dene people have been hunting caribou as food for hundreds of years. There have been studies showing that when Indigenous communities are responsible for governing their own land, the climate footprint and greenhouse gas emissions goes down significantly in the area. Governance of ancestral land is considered a privilege given by the Crown, even though Dene people have been occupying the land for hundreds, if not thousands of years. For my project, I would like to research deeper into land-back policies, forgotten treaties of the Northwest Territories, and how colonization and generational trauma have impacted the traditional lives of the Dene people, as well as how youth are consciously reclaiming their traditions by learning from their elders. So we've all heard of the Arctic ice melting, and this is a little bit of insight on how that affects Indigenous communities. Climate change, melting ice, and northern Indigenous way of life. It is expected that climate change around the world will impact the way of life in the future. However, one of the most immediate threats is polar ice, and Indigenous and Inuit communities of Canada will be affected. The traditional practices like hunting and gathering are essential in preserving Indigenous cultural identity. With the melting of the Arctic due to expansion of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the population of local animals in the Arctic is decreasing rapidly. Winter travel routes for the Indigenous populations are changing as well as harsh water changes, making it harder to fish. Not only does climate change affect the land and animals, but it also directly affects the Dene way of life. In this essay, I would like to explore the links of overconsumption, capitalist culture, and globalization have between decreasing traditions for Indigenous cultures of the North. I would like to explore on a deeper level how Indigenous cultures from around the world are being hit first with rising greenhouse gas emissions. I would also like to explore concepts on how youth can make a change to try and stop or reverse the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples. So through the course readings, I will be relying heavily on the Truth and Reconciliation in Canadian Schools by Pamela Toulouse, specifically the pages 24 to 25, 90 to 92, and the entirety of Chapter 3. These pages and chapters provide insight on the Inuit way of life, as well as treaties upholding treaties throughout Canada. Insight into treaties can provide proof that the pipelines being built on Dene land are a breach of the negotiations between Inuit people and the Crown. This book also provides important insight on how the Canadian school systems teach young Canadians how to create longevity through traditional teachings. I would also like to cite from the Youth Reimagine Playbook of Canada by UNICEF to brainstorm ideas on how northern-based youth can help promote advocacy within their community to encourage change. Research into the playbook can provide insight on how youth programs like Dene Climate Change Action for Youth can improve their strategies to reach more listeners in their communities and within legislation. And then here are the sites for that. And then at the bottom, I have all the sites for each slide, if anyone's interested in looking in on it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.